Hello and welcome to Calgarian Born Chinese. It's presently May at the time I'm filming this, so happy Asian Heritage Month to all of my fellow Asian Canadians out there. This is the last episode of my docuseries for StoryHive, so forgive me if I'm feeling a little bit bittersweet to be at the tail end of my time with this project. Bad puns aside though, I wanted to dedicate this last episode to inviting you over for dinner and talking about 3 Chinese dishes: yukbang, ho yao sang choi, and mongguo no mei chi. They're dishes that are rooted in my experience as a Chinese Calgarian, and I hope you enjoy them with me. But as is the case with every Chinese meal, we start with rice. Today we're sticking to good old-fashioned steamed rice made in our trusty rice cooker. I'm pretty habituated when it comes to making rice at home, but the general rationale when it comes to rinsing is that it cleans the rice and removes some of the surface starch, which would otherwise cause the grains to stick to each other. There's also the knuckle rule that a lot of households abide by, but I've got lines in the inside of the pot here, so I'm just going to accept my privilege where I can and tell you to do as I say and not as I do. Now that the rice is on, I'm going to prep some romaine and leave it off to the side to soak before we get back to it later on. We're actually going to be cooking it off at the end before we serve because it's a relatively short process, and it's at this point that I want to head off a critique and acknowledge that boiling lettuce might grate up against your food channel convictions about what you should and shouldn't do with cooking your leafy greens. But let me just personally assure you that Chinese people have been boiling our lettuce for a long time, and dare I say, actually enjoying it too. Personally, I love ho yao sang choi because it's an incredibly easy and forgiving dish to make, which I appreciate when I'm low on time, as well as nostalgic for the flavors that I remember as a child. Long story short, don't knock it till you try it. The main star of today's menu is yukbang, which loosely translates to mean meatloaf. It's an iconic representation of Cantonese home cooking, and I remember eating it a lot growing up because I think it was such a simple recipe for my parents to make and flexible enough to work around whatever ingredients they happen to have on hand in the pantry. Traditionally, the base for yukbang is ground pork, but we're going to be using Beyond instead. We're also going to be using pickled mustard greens, water chestnuts, and green onion as our primary mix-ins, but I've also seen everything from shiitake mushrooms to salted fish, fermented black beans, salted duck eggs, bamboo shoots. You name it, chances are it fits in yukbang. When it comes to seasoning though, this is where a lot of the character of the dish makes its way into the fold. We'll be adding a quarter cup of Chinese wine, followed by a couple of dashes of white pepper. We're also going to add some red fermented bean curd, which I personally love for its umami qualities and distinct sort of Chinese funk that's present in dishes like Lohan Jai or Buddha's Delight, and this is a classic vegetarian Chinese New Year's dish that I like to try to make on occasion. We're also going to finish it off with some soy sauce and cornstarch with water to bind everything together, and then we mix. I recently attended the Fascinasian Film Festival here in Calgary a couple of weeks ago, and I have to tell you that, outside of the brilliant name, I was absolutely floored by the experience. The movies were definitely worth the price of admission alone, but they also had some amazing hospitality, like where else can you get Chinese sesame crackers at a theater concession? One of the movies I saw was about a young Korean Canadian growing up in the suburbs, and when he gets placed in his first elementary school classroom, the kids start making fun of the kimbap his mom's packed away in his lunch for the day, and he ends up throwing it into the trash, and later on that evening he supplicates his mom for a sandwich the next day, and it reminded me that it seemed like a rite of passage for all of us Asian kids who brought eel and rice in our lunch boxes and endured the same types of trials and tribulations. As all good movies do, it made me think about the unique challenges that BIPOC kids in school are experiencing today. I mean, I sure hope kids aren't having teachers making slant-eyed Asian jokes like they did when I was in elementary school, but I think the challenges are just different in nature. More broadly speaking, Calgary is a city whose population growth is largely being driven by immigration, and I predict that our food culture will experience some radical shifts in the future to reflect that as well. This is actually my pitch to any investors out there who want in on a Chinese-Italian fusion noodle restaurant I've been playing around with in my head. Send me a text or email, and I look forward to hearing from you about this lucrative business opportunity. Once everything's mixed in, we throw it into the steamer for 15 to 20 minutes. My parents usually make bang in a metal steaming dish, but I don't have one that fits my steamer, so I use a clay pot or bowl instead. You can use any glass or metal dish that can withstand high heat and humidity. Personally, I like to add fresh ginger root as a garnish, but it's kind of a subjective inclusion insofar as adding it to the mix or having it in your recipe at all is up to your preferences and tastes. Next, I'm going to show you how to make mangwa no mochi, or mango mochi. At its core, mochi is a sticky rice cake that has some version across most East Asian countries like dango in Japan or chapsilduk in Korea. The general premise, though, of a sweet, chewy rice cake is the same throughout, and this is unsurprising when you find out that the primary ingredient used to make it is, you guessed it, based in rice, more specifically, glutinous rice flour. The recipe I use starts with 4 main ingredients: coconut milk, sugar, glutinous rice flour, and cornstarch. Once everything is combined in the bowl, you whisk until the mixture becomes a smooth paste. I use a colander to act as a sieve into a lightly oiled dish, but as long as you don't have any visible clumps in the batter, that's the only thing that you're really trying to avoid with this step. The oil is also important, not so much for the recipe, but to prevent the mochi from sticking to the dish, which is a problem you'll quickly find out to be a pretty big pain in the butt if you make this for the first time and forget this step. We're going to add the mixture to the steamer and come back in 20. While that's on, I'm going to get some coconut flakes in a cast iron pan to coat the outside of the mochi. You can also toast up some rice flour that you have left over from the earlier step, but personally, I enjoy the color and flavor of toasted coconut, so it's really a choose-your-own-adventure type of decision here. My mum is originally from Hong Kong, and the last time I visited was probably over a decade ago now. But one of the most memorable parts of the trip was when we took a ferry to Lantau Island, which is known for its picturesque hiking and 34-meter giant bronze Buddha statue. But for me though, the strongest memory was the taste of mangwa no mochi. There's a lady running a food stand by the ferry gate, and every time I taste the combination of mango and glutinous rice cake today, it instantly transports me back to that moment in time. The combination of sweet and sour wrapped up in the overlapping textures after spending hours out in the heat and humidity of East Asia is about as close to the Ratatouille fireworks scene as I've probably gotten to in my life. Once the coconut's done, we'll transfer it to a bowl and into the fridge to cool. At this point, the mochi is finished steaming and will look something like this. Which is fine on its own, but mochi is characteristically chewy and stretchy, and we have to help it get there through some good old-fashioned elbow grease until it reaches a suitable level of elasticity. I'm using a pair of metal chopsticks here to stir, and unless you have reinforced wooden chopsticks, I can say from experience that you want to be using tools that aren't at risk of snapping, especially given how much resistance you can actually get from the mochi. I skipped over transferring it to another container and letting it cool in the fridge for about 30 minutes, but once that's done, it's on to assembly, which involves wrapping the mango with the mochi and then rolling it in the toasted coconut. If you want to be particular about consistency, then I recommend splitting the mochi evenly before wrapping, which you can do either by size or by weight. The fun part of this recipe, though, is that you can use a variety of fillings as well, from peanuts to sesame to other fruits like strawberries. My dad's parents used to run a Chinese restaurant out in Medicine Hat, and during the limited conversations where we do talk about it, I don't really get the impression that anyone on his side of the family saw it as a particularly glamorous profession, especially as a minority Chinese family living in a predominantly Caucasian town. The only time that the family had off work was Chinese New Year's, and this was validated during the interview with Ron that we did back at Boo Vintage, where he also said that for many Chinese families, Chinese New Year's was the one time in the year where Chinese families from small towns the province over would gather to share news, gossip, and socialize with the people they hadn't seen since the previous year. No doubt, food played a significant role in these celebrations, and given the prominence of restaurateurs in this community, I can only imagine the feasts that they were able to conjure when cooking for each other rather than how can I put this? Maybe their less discerning clientele? The last dish I'm making is ho yao sang choi, which means oyster sauce lettuce. Sang choi in Cantonese is a homonym for a verb that means to make money, making it not just a health-conscious food, but also an auspicious thing to eat to gain wealth. Or so I've been told. I'm a few lettuce heads deep at this point and still waiting on a check from the relevant authority to arrive in the mail. The recipe is as advertised though, simply boil a head of romaine lettuce for about a minute and drain. I forgot to prep for this part, but you can make a very easy Cantonese style brown sauce to go with it using oyster sauce, garlic, soy sauce, and some of the leftover cornstarch water mix from earlier that I saved. Simply combine and bring the heat up to thicken, serving it over the lettuce. I've always been confused by the term Chinese food, and I think that it all started back when I saw a Seinfeld episode as a kid where Jerry dares Elaine to steal an egg roll from a table and eat it in front of them, which was weird because I never ate egg rolls at home as a kid. Definitely not the point of the episode, but growing up, my friends also had different understandings of Chinese food as well, and there was definitely a point in reconnecting with my Chinese side as an adult, where I came face to face with institutional racism, and in this process, I renounced all Western Chinese food as inauthentic and even offensive, as you might see a caricature artist highlighting all of those features that you're extra sensitive to. But partly in the process of learning about Calgary's Chinatown earlier on in the series, I came to better appreciate the fact that westernized Chinese dishes like egg foo young and chop suey, these were cultural innovations by Canada's earliest Asian immigrants. And more than that, they were working with the limited ingredients and means available to them at the time. So even though I never really had ginger beef that often growing up, the fact that it was invented here, and that the restaurant credited with its invention closing down last year to relatively little fanfare, that kind of news is sad, especially when you consider the adversity that early Chinese Calgarians had to endure to make it, and our inability to preserve that history for future generations is failing them in an education on their cultural heritage here in Calgary. But as an adult, I'm learning to exercise agency over the things that I have control over, and a big part of that is reclaiming the Chinese food that I grew up eating, especially the foods that I used to eat a lot of and therefore used to resent because it was the usual and different than what my friends and neighbors ate. Over the past few years, I've been building up my collection of pantry and fridge staples and incorporating them into my regular weekly meal rotations. Most of us never formally learn how to cook from our parents, and I can definitely vouch from my experience that the food that we ate on weeknights was a means to an end, not a process of passing on their cultural heritage to the next generation. I think it's the same with small business owners in Chinatown who want their children to have careers that don't necessarily align with running a Chinese restaurant or grocery store that offers products you can't get through some of the bigger grocery chains. There's also the changing demographics of people visiting and living in Chinatown, and Asian food expression is growing as a result. If I think philosophically on it, this change isn't really a good or bad thing, but the onus does fall on us as individuals to do what we can to protect and pass on what we choose as meaningful, because at the end of the day, no one else will. And so personally, I'll be back in the kitchen tomorrow, further experimenting and refining recipes using tofu, rice noodles, fermented black beans, and sweet and sour sauce. But for now, I'm going to sit back and enjoy a little taste that reminds me of the joy of being a Chinese person living in Calgary. My name is CJ, and I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your support throughout this series. Thank you as well to TELUS STORYHIVE for the opportunity to share my story, and thank you to the stewards of Treaty 7 lands for your unparalleled generosity. Be kind to each other and yourselves, and take care.